This is the Jackson County Courthouse in Jackson County, Alabama. The Jackson County Courthouse in Jackson County, Alabama happens to be in Scottsboro, Alabama. And if you are familiar with the term woke, it was coined by noted folk singer Huddy Ledbetter, aka Leadbelly. And the term woke came about because he did an interview back in the 1930s talking about a case that happened here in Scottsboro, Alabama. The case came to be known as the case of the Scottsboro boys. And Mr. Leadbelly, when he was giving his interview, basically was recounting how he had met the Scottsboro boys. And I'm going to show you what's around this town square in Scottsboro, Alabama. And it's a lovely little town. And actually, you could actually say it's rather pretty. But sometimes a pretty face can hide an ugly heart. Or, in this case, an ugly past. Because the Scottsboro boys case was one of the worst cases of judicial misconduct in American history that we know of, right? Because the situation with the Scottsboro boys was in the early 1930s, I want to say 1931, 9 young black men were riding the rails. That means that they were catching trains illegally, or caught a train illegally, right? A freight train. And that was common back then because that was the time of the Great Depression. And a lot of people were looking for work and trying to change their economic situation. So these 9 young men, 4 of them knew each other, 5 of them didn't, were on this train. And it passed through northern Alabama, because we're in northern Alabama. This is the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. And if you were to see this whole town, you'd see that it is surrounded by mountains and lakes. It's really quite lovely here. But the issue is, these young men riding these rails in 1931, they got into an altercation with a group of white young men on that train, right? And once they got into that altercation with the other group, a fight ensued, a full-on fight, and the white guys lost. And some of them got thrown off the train or encouraged to leave the train. And some of those losers made contact with the local law enforcement in the area that they got thrown off. And those people, the law enforcement officers, stopped the train. They stopped the train and they got all of the black people who were riding the train, it was both black and white on that train at the time, removed all the black people and arrested them. All of them arrested them. Eventually, they settled on 9 young black men as the perpetrators of the crime of fighting a group of 6, I think it's 6 young white men. That was a fight. One group won, one group lost. Okay? So, they get these 9 boys off this train, they arrest them, and guess what? There happened to be 2 white women on that same train. And these 2 white women, when they were interviewed by the police, they yelled rape. They said that they were gang raped by these black boys. Now, I'm calling them boys, but they kind of ranged in age. The oldest amongst them was 19, and the youngest was 12 years old, accused of rape in Scottsboro, Alabama. So what happened was they arrested these boys and charged them with this rape, and they had a trial in, like, I think it was a week. And they rustled up 2 attorneys to represent these 9 boys. One of them had never had a criminal trial in his life. He was a real estate attorney and the town drunk. And the other one, he had had criminal experience, but he had not tried a case in decades because he was an older man, and allegedly he was suffering from senility. These were their 2 lawyers for these 9 young men accused with gang raping 2 young ladies. Okay? So what happened was they had these trials, and they did them like 2 at a time, two defendants or so at a time, right? And with these people having less than a week to prepare these cases, of course they weren't ready. So quite naturally, the boys all got convicted. And let me tell you, they had a doctor who did a rape examination on these girls, and neither one of it was 2 doctors actually, and neither doctor found any evidence of sexual trauma. There was no evidence of any kind of rape, right? So based on that, these boys got convicted. 8 of them were sentenced to be electrocuted in Alabama's electric chair. The youngest of them, who was 12 years old at the time, yeah, the jury convicted him too, but they could not unanimously agree on whether or not he should be sentenced to death. So they were nice enough, well, they didn't agree. And what happened was the judge made the decision to sentence him to life in prison at 12 years old for rape. Okay. Eventually these cases were appealed and made their way all the way up to the Supreme Court. And trust me, the Supreme Court in 1931 wasn't exactly the most liberal bastion in the world, but even with them, they realized that that was a problem. You're gonna have a trial that basically occurred a week after a case, as serious as this, with 2 incompetent attorneys that didn't pass the smell test. So the Supreme Court remanded or sent the case back down to the state of Alabama to give these boys a fair trial. Okay? So they tried them again. And this time, the same thing happened. They got convicted. Luckily, the judge in the second trial of some of the co-defendants, some of the defendants, realized that this wasn't fair, wasn't right. And he basically threw the case out and said it wasn't fair. And then that one went all the way back up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court agreed that they did not get a fair trial, mainly because there weren't any black people on the jury. Okay? So they had to try these boys again. And they did try them again. And this third trial, they found a black person to sit on the jury. One black guy. And again, they convicted them. So they appealed again, and it went back up to the Supreme Court. So they had another trial, a fourth trial. And this is 6 years after the fact. And again, they were convicted by predominantly white juries. Okay? The outrage from the rest of the nation was so compelling that the state of Alabama ended up cutting some deals to free some of these boys. Some of them escaped, and one actually was retried. He was found guilty of rape, but instead of giving him the death penalty, the jury decided to compromise and only gave him 75 years to serve in prison. And believe it or not, that was the first time in the state of Alabama where a black man was convicted of raping a white woman and he did not get the death penalty. The very first time that a black man was spared the death penalty being convicted of raping a white woman. But he got 75 years. Eventually, all of the young men were either released or escaped, and their lives were as painful and terrible as you could imagine. Some of them suffered, actually most of them, suffered lifelong mental illness based on this. Some of them ended up dying horrible deaths. Some of them, one guy was actually convicted up in Michigan. He got into a bar fight with somebody and stabbed that person. And he spent some time in prison in Michigan before he died. But the whole situation was bad because none of them deserved any of this. And let me remind you, or let me let you know, that one of the white women that accused these boys of rape, she recanted her story. She apologized, she testified at the remainder of the trials, and let them know that this never happened, that her and her friend were scared that they would be charged with something called the Mann Act, which basically means that it's illegal to transport women across state lines for immoral acts. And they were prostitutes, and they felt like they may be prosecuted for their crimes. Now, mind you now, there was never any question or never really any definitive proof that these black boys had sex with these white women. She never said that they did. Well, after she recanted her story, she said they didn't even hardly speak to them while they were on the train with the black boys. Nevertheless, with a witness that recanted her statement, actually a victim that recanted her statement, no evidence from a physical standpoint showing that these young women were raped, and no credible corroborating evidence from any other witnesses, these boys were convicted. Eventually, in 1976, the governor of the state of Alabama pardoned all of the Scottsboro boys. Okay? The name of that governor was George Wallace. It's funny how history works.